Cindy, nice to see you. All right.
Hello.
Gary, I haven't seen you in a while. Nice to see you.
Hi, trying to get my video to work.
No, you're working, man. You're
You can see
good.
my face?
Yes, I can.
Oh, all I have is a picture of a home plate and a batter at plate. So,
Well,
oh well.
just so you know, we can see you. So, be careful with the burrito or whatever.
There you go.
All right. So, three,
Interesting Parsha.
3 weeks in a row. 3 weeks in a row. You're not sick of me yet. Okay. So, we have, as Jeff just had an interesting portion, it's a double portion this week. Most of us probably know since you guys are old pros. But, we read the Torah on an annual cycle. And chapter and verse, by the way, is not a Jewish thing at all. I mean, obviously we use it, but it was invented by the Masoretes. The Jewish, organizational structure of the Torah are Parshiot, Torah portions, usually named for one of the first words, not by any greater meta, thematic thinking. But there are 54 Torah portions, 52 weeks in the year, most of us know, and then add in a bunch of holidays that totally mess up the reading of Torah. And the result is, in order to get through the whole Torah in a year, there are 7 different parshiot that can be coupled or doubled, we usually say. 7 different parshiot that can be coupled or doubled. And they're not chosen for any significant reason other than I think many of them are just shorter. So you can, hey Roy, nice to see you. Looking forward to Oregon, my man. All right. So Roy's coming on the Temple golf trip in 2 weeks. So there's so there's 7 parshiot that in any given year can be doubled. It's usually only 2, I think, or 3 that are ever doubled in a year. So this particular year, parshiot, which is the plural of parsha, Matot and Masei, which are the final 2 parshiot in the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, are doubled. So we're reading the last 2 parshiot this week in the book of Numbers. And as Jeff said, there's some interesting stuff there. Can't promise that what I've chosen to focus on today, Jeff, is what you think is interesting, but there's lots of interesting stuff there. And among the things that at least I think are interesting is that, and some of us may have heard of this, the idea of cities of refuge, right? That there were places that people who committed crimes, specifically in the text, people who, I'm going to be deliberate in the way I say this, people who, a person who kills another person can go, we'll debate murder and manslaughter in a few minutes, can flee and go, and where they can in essence, seek refuge. They're exiled in essence from home and their community, but they are theoretically safe in these cities of refuge. And I think, and what I thought would be interesting to look at today is, at least personally, I think it raises, and the rabbis in their discussion of these cities of refuge raise, some of the ethical dilemmas that really, I think, exist here, right? Which I just alluded to, is the distinction between murder and manslaughter, intent, accidental, killing versus premeditated, all the things that in many cases, come up in a murder trial in, court today, right? So I thought we'd look at that. I brought a bunch of texts and, hopefully we'll make for a rousing discussion. All right. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. And move a little bit so that you guys aren't distracted. Okay, so that was more or less my introduction, but I'm going to share because I can't say it any better than Rabbi Gunther Plaut. Just as a quick side note, the Torah commentary that most likely you'll find if you walk into any Reform synagogue, Wilsh Boulevard Temple, any of our campuses, including the university campus, is a Torah commentary written by a rabbi named Gunther Plaut, who was the senior rabbi at Holy Blossom Temple in Ontario. I want to say, I'm forgetting now, Montreal or Quebec. Toronto. Close. I knew it was Canada. Thanks, Merle.
You got it.
Fun fact, our beloved, Mehi Zichrono Livracha, Harvey Fields, was the associate rabbi briefly at Holy Blossom right before coming to Wilsh Boulevard Temple. So Gunther compiled the definitive, at least, Reform commentary. And one of I thought this little kind of piece that sort of sets up the Parshat and connects it to, at least in a way, what I spoke about last week, not so much on our Zoom, but that evening were the daughters of Zelophehad. And Susan Rabbi spoke about this in her Shabbat message last week, how the laws of inheritance were altered because of their desire to be able to retain land. And so here, the commentary sort of connects those two themes. So it says, other Torah portions emphasize that the Levites were to be landless, while Numbers 18, which is a little ways back, provides for their support to compensate for their landlessness, right? So part of the reason that the Kohanim and the Leviim, everybody who worked in the temple, were supposed to be compensated and receive tithes and all these things, is because they weren't a part of the agrarian land ownership sort of system that everybody else was. So Deuteronomy 2 speaks of them as a people who need protection similar to strangers, orphans, and widows. Yet, the present section does make a land allotment to them. Some scholars believe that the provisions in this chapter, which assign 48 towns west and east of the Jordan to the Levites, were never fully carried out. And in that effect, the Levites were scattered among the tribes, without sufficient holdings of their own. But it has been shown that for a short time during the time of David and Solomon, Levitical towns played an important socio-political role, and that Levitical families lived in these cities at some time. Among the designated Levitical cities, this is why we're talking about this week, were 6 that served as cities of refuge. An arrangement, reflecting, I should say, ancient concepts of law and justice, right? So I think there's an interesting kind of connection there that 6, and there were more, but the 6 primary cities of refuge were cities that were in essence operated and lived in by these, we'll call them the rabbis of the day. They weren't rabbis, obviously they weren't rabbis, but the Leviim. Okay. Anyone want to read the kind of the actual text of the Torah portion before we get into some of the commentaries?
I can.
Thanks, Merle.
These 6 cities shall serve the Israelites and the resident aliens among them for refuge, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there. Anyone, however, who strikes another with an iron object, so that death results, is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. If he struck him with a stone or with a stone tool that could cause death, and death resulted, he is a murderer. The murderer must be put to death. Similarly, if the object with which he struck him was a wooden tool that could cause death, the death resulted, he is a murderer, and the murderer must be put to death. Can you scroll up a little more?
Absolutely.
The blood. Okay, wait a minute. The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. It is he who shall put him to death upon encounter. So too, if he pushed him in hate or hurled something at him on purpose and death resulted, or if he struck him with his hand in enmity and death resulted, the assailant shall be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death upon encounter. But if he pushed him without malice, afterthought, or hurled any object at him unintentionally, or inadvertently dropped upon him any deadly object of stone, and death resulted, though he was not an enemy of his and did not seek his harm, in such cases he the assembly shall decide between the slayer and the blood avenger. The assembly shall protect the manslayer from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore to the city of refuge to which he fled, and there he shall remain until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the sacred oil.
Thanks, Merle.
Is
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Really quick. Is the assembly like the court?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Or the community.
All right.
So two things that really I think are highlighted here, at least for me, and I welcome any other things that are highlighted, but for me are two concepts. One is the idea, which keeps getting referred to here, of the blood avenger, right? Which theoretically is the victim's family. Okay, and this is something that obviously, revenge killings exist in our world. It happens in the gang world and all those sorts of things. But still to this day, in some, tribal and in Middle Eastern countries, it's a thing, right? I ended up not using it in a sermon, but there was a story that I found, I think probably in some like Chicken Soup for the Soul book that my mom's friend Jack Canfield, made a living off of. And the story's about, I believe it was in Iraq, a man whose son was murdered. The perpetrator was brought to trial. And then there became a question of capital punishment. And the question and the decision of capital punishment did not rest with the judge or the jury. It rested with the father of the boy who was killed. And it's a beautiful story. And at the end, because the father speaks about his pain and his anger, and at the end he says, killing another person's son does not bring my son back, right? But that's a long way around of saying that this is not, just in the Torah. Still, remnants of this still exist. And so that's one. This idea of that it's on the family or of the victim, plays a role in punishment, and that will play out later in terms of why the cities of refuge potentially are important. And two, the concept of intent. That the intention of the presumably guilty party matters, right? That if he, here it says he, but it could be she, intends to kill someone, that's murder, and that's one thing. If it's accidental, obviously, that's a whole other situation, right? Which again, I mentioned earlier, murder versus manslaughter in our own legal system today. So those are kind of the two operating principles, at least for me, that really hop out of the text that the rabbis sort of jump on. Have I provoked anything yet? Hey, Brad.
Hi. Well,
Brad, you should know. I'm going to interrupt you. You should know. Penina's not here, but she would tell you because Penina was with us in person last Friday evening for Kabbalat Shabbat at the Irmis campus. And I actually, Brad, I ended up quoting you in my drive that evening because I mentioned this idea when we talked about the Parsha last week of how the woman who is sort of sent by her father, who's the king of the Midianites, to fornicate, right, is in a way the victim of her father and the victim of Pinchas. Yeah. And I mentioned to all of you that was very interesting to me because it contrasted with sort of these empowered women, which is what I ended up talking about on Friday, the daughters of Zelophehad. So thank you for that. I hope your ears were burning. I invoked that last week. So give me something I can use tonight, Brad.
Okay, well, I'm going to try here. I think the passage makes an interesting pivot because at the beginning, there's no concept. If you scroll up, there's no concept of intent at the beginning of this passage. It's strictly a function. Whether murder takes place is a function of the object that's being used. A certain object is going to cause murder. And then starting in, I don't know, verse 21 or ever, somewhere down there,
Yeah.
we take a pivot and all of a
Yes.
sudden we start looking at
Yeah,
intent.
22. But if he pushes it
22.
without malice or forethought, yes.
So I'm wondering if there may have been two writers involved here. It started off one way and then it veered because there was a second writer. It just seems
Well, so here's what
interesting.
I'd say. I think it's an interesting point in one regard. To me, what I think about when you raise this point is like, what does it matter what the instrument is, right? Like, to put it in a vulgar contemporary context, if you stab somebody or you shoot somebody, does it really make a difference, right? Like, assault or murder is murder. But here's what's interesting to me. I think intent does kind of come here a little bit sooner because look, the very first verse, it says, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally can go to a city of refuge, right? And then moving right along, now here, right? If it's a wooden tool, no, I just saw this. 20, right? If he pushes him in hate or hurls something at him on purpose, and death results. So I think it's there because I think the setup is the very first verse, which is, okay, there's these 6 cities that are cities of refuge, and you're only allowed to go there, we're going to get deeper into this in a minute, if what you did was unintentional. If you're a serial killer, Charles Manson doesn't get to go to the city of refuge, right? You God forbid, you're in a car accident and somebody in another vehicle dies, yet, you may be responsible for causing the accident, but you didn't, hopefully set out on running errands that morning, with that intent. But let's go a little deeper, Brad, because I think that some of the other commentaries kind of hit this idea of intent too, and we'll kind of see where that lands maybe. Okay. So, here's a little piece of Mishnah. I'll read this one. So, Mishnah says, if one intended to kill an animal, and presumably instead killed a person, right? Or intended to kill a non-Jew and killed a Jew, or intended to kill a fetus that was not viable and killed a viable fetus, he is exempt. If he intended to strike another on his loins without enough strength to kill him by striking his loins, and the blow hit him on his heart with enough strength to kill him and he died, he's exempt. If he intended to strike another on his heart with enough strength to kill him on his heart, and the blow hit him on his loins without enough strength to kill him on his loins and he died, he is exempt. If he intended to strike an adult without enough strength to kill an adult, and the blow landed on a minor with enough strength to kill a minor, and he died, he is exempt. If he intended to strike a minor with enough strength to kill a minor, and the blow landed on an adult without enough strength to kill an adult, and he died, he is exempt. However, if he intended to strike another on his loins with enough strength to kill him on his loins, and the blow landed on his heart, and he died, he is liable. Similarly, if he intended to strike an adult with enough strength to kill an adult, and the blow landed on a minor and he died, he is liable. Rabbi Shimon says, even if he intended to kill this one and he killed that one, he is exempt. Okay, right? So this is a very long way around of saying, and we could argue this all day, in essence, if you get into a fight with somebody, violence is never the answer, as we tell our kids, right? And you punch somebody with no thought that that's going to be fatal, and for whatever reason they die, your intent was not to kill them, right? So this is really, I think, trying to zero in on this idea of maybe not necessarily premeditation, but intent, right? And the intent of the perpetrator matters, I would say, is the takeaway from this in the mind of the rabbis. Brad, you're muted. I hear you. Maybe you're not talking to me. Okay. Or us, I should say. Okay.
Just talking to myself, trying to make sense of that last sentence.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I think the last sentence to me, again, maybe it's just where my brain's going. It's just too easier to put it in contemporary context, right? That if, a murderer intends to kill person A, right? Here's a good example. Maybe murder wasn't involved, but here's a good example. What was it? A month ago, somebody having lunch at El Pastayo in Beverly Hills got shot because he was wearing a far too expensive wristwatch. And Susan shaking her head. Maybe you didn't read the paper, Susan. So a guy was sitting at El Pastayo, lovely Italian trattoria in the corner of Beverly Hills, always very busy on the sidewalk, wearing I believe that, this is just quoting the LA Times, a $500,000 wristwatch. That's more than an expensive one. He's a watch dealer, apparently. And some hoodlums at gunpoint demanded the watch from him. He refused to give it to them, got into a physical altercation with them, and the gun went off and shot, not fatally, but shot another diner at another table. Okay, nobody died. Clearly, these folks are criminals. They were apprehended a few days later. However, to put this last phrase from Rabbi Shimon in context, I would say there is a difference between, and who knows how this would play out in court, right? Let's say, God forbid, the bystander at the other table was shot but died, right? I think there would be a conversation in court today as to whether or not that's murder or manslaughter. Because maybe, and this might be a bridge too far, because the motive was really robbery, but maybe the perpetrator's intent was to harm the guy with the watch. It was definitely not to harm a woman sitting 4 tables away. Now, that happened as a result of his actions, and so, I would not say he is exempt the way Rabbi Shimon does, right? But it was not his intention. And I think that's where we make a distinction potentially, I don't know how it would play out, I'm not a lawyer, between, homicide and manslaughter. Still guilty, still liable, still going to jail, hopefully, but, it's a different equation. So I think that's kind of what Rabbi Shimon's trying to get to. We're going to move on a little bit here. Oh, wait, I saw a hand go up. Jeff, was that you?
Oh,
No. Sorry, I saw it. Okay. Oh, Douglas.
yeah, thank you.
Of course.
It bothers me that somebody can act out of anger and it's not murder. I think it was last week we had the Torah portion about Pinchas
Yep.
killing the people.
Yep.
And God rewarded him
Yep.
for losing his temper, and it wasn't murder. That just doesn't seem right.
I'm with Brad.
Yeah. I agree. So, and this is going to be one of those times. I don't know if he's listening or watching. My father sent me a text message last week. And he only caught part of it shortly after our session. I think he caught part of it on Facebook or something. In a way, sort of highlighting this, like, is this really the relationship we have with God in the world, right? Because it's so problematic in I think both these Parshiot. I will confess I neglected to respond to him because I forgot about the text message until it just came to mind. I think this is one of those situations in which there are many, and you've all heard me say this many times, in which, we are not, Judaism of the Torah doesn't exist today, right? There are no synagogues in the Torah. There are no rabbis in the Torah. There's no prayer in the Torah. It's what anthropologists and sociologists call a sacrificial cult, right? In which, not cult in the, living on a compound kind of thing, but right in terms of a community in which ritual sacrifices are the way that human beings communicate with this sense of the divine. Right, rabbinic Judaism, as we know it today, is a creation of the first century, and has evolved ever since, and really, more or less how we know it, a creation of probably the 5th or 6th century. But so I personally don't think that it's productive for us, despite all my references to violence at El Pastayo. I personally don't think it's very productive or an interesting conversation to look at biblical text through a 21st century lens. Because the world is different, we're different, Judaism's different, we might argue that God is different, right? If I were a Christian preacher, I might draw a distinction between, as they're fond of saying, the God of the Old Testament versus, a more kind of contemporary idea. And by the way, I think that our notions of theology have greatly evolved since, the time of the Torah. So that's a long way around of saying I absolutely agree with you, Douglas. I think that, it's incredibly problematic, maybe in general, but certainly from a contemporary standpoint, to think about some kind of divine reward for what, murder, manslaughter, whatever, is still killing 2 people, right? I think is incredibly problematic. However, in a ancient tribal at war world in which, remember, Pinchas comes in the larger narrative of the Israelites being, in essence, at war with the Midianites, and assuming it's a Midianite man who's coming, and I think it's a different calculation. We might not agree today, but I think it's a different calculation. Susan, I see a hand, and then Gary, I know you have one up too.
Yes, am I on? Oh, I want to lower this hand because it's okay.
Oh, I can do it for you. Okay.
Thank you for that explanation, and I think you're absolutely right. I know for Merle it's problematic. It is for our 20th century eyes, but the Talmud and the rabbis were great correctives for this, and after this period, more rabbinically responsive, and I think we have to try and get our mindset into this period. And the flagrant immorality of the couple that was doing this.
Yeah.
And they did it right in front of the whole community, right after God gave his 10 commandments. So, I mean,
it's a little,
Exactly. It's, they're thumbing their nose at and then also these are theologically young people who actually didn't have much of a religion beforehand, and it kind of saps them the energy of their devotion. And then that's one thing. The other thing was a plague, for goodness sakes, and he averted the plague then. And then a number of commentators say that the reward that he gets was less a reward than a corrective to help him temper his passion. And in these days, people were killed for less. And when you think about other societies as well, I always try and put myself in the mindset of that era, and then to see what lesson can be learned from it. And the lesson here is really the offense of immorality, and the problem with rampant, which is sexuality of just, and we, still are living with some of those problems.
Gary, and then Jeff, and then Bruce.
I'll pass this time. People have said what I was going to say.
Sorry, Gary. Jeff, Bruce, and Merle.
couple of things strike me. One is that murder, death, whether it's inadvertent or directed, is from page 1 of the Bible. From Cain and Abel through the end of time, it is an element, unfortunately, of the worst of human interactions. And the unfortunate concept that I carry around, and it's maybe my problem, is that people have not evolved emotionally.
Yeah.
Or society in general as a collective has not overcome the baser characteristics of our personalities. And though we read these stories over and over and over again, it's like anything that's repetitive, it almost loses its influence over us. We see it as almost an expected normal, unfortunately.
I think,
and that's pretty scary.
I forget if it was
When you look
yesterday or the day before's LA Times that highlighting, which I knew because it'd been spoken about. I might be getting the statistic wrong, the number wrong, but I believe that homicides year to date in Los Angeles are up 50%.
Frightening.
You know,
It's up here too for
right?
some reason.
And, you know, we like to think of ourselves in California as so much more progressive and, you know, ahead of everybody else. Well, that's great, but it doesn't stop people from killing each other, right? So you hit the nail on the head there, Jeff. I think that maybe that's part of the reason that,
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't understand the underlying problem with humanity in general. There's no lessons ever learned. The mistakes are repetitively done. The interactions in society haven't grown in an ethical direction, and I don't care what religion we're talking about. And when is it ever going to evolve? And if it isn't going to evolve, why have religion to begin with?
So I don't know that I can answer that in 26 minutes, much less 26 years. But I would say I think there is progression and evolution of humanity and human nature. I think society does get better. I do think, generally speaking, despite all the ills in I won't speak about the world, at least in our nation, that, you know, we are a more evolved and tolerant and compassionate society than we were, you know, centuries ago. But it's incremental and it's slow. And it's, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward sometimes. We're probably never going to get rid of killing, much less murder in our society and world. But if we can get it to a, you know, much lower number, make it more infrequent, that's progress. But I agree it's slow and maybe not even in some of our lifetimes, and that absolutely makes it feel defeating at sometimes. Bruce?
The LA Times about a 50% increase in these violent crimes. And
the hope, and this, by the way, this was in the article as well, as not me. The hope, and obviously we don't come to Torah study to talk about the LA Times, but the hope is that this was an anomaly because it had been on the decline for a significant amount of time, that this was an anomaly, in part because of COVID and many other things, and that, you know, we'll see where we are a year from now. Hopefully it was a momentary spike, but we'll see. Bruce.
Okay, 3 points I want to bring up. First of all, your comment about prayer and the Torah. I believe that when Moses prayed to God that Sarah have a child, that was a form of prayer.
That's absolutely true.
It may not be a communal prayer. Let me finish. It may not be communal prayer. It may be individual prayer, but individual prayer is part of the Jewish tradition.
Absolutely.
And I take issue with that statement that you made.
Absolutely.
All right. Secondly, about Pinchas, which gave me a lot of trouble last week when I listened to your talk. It's quite possible that this whole story about Pinchas was a justification for his lineage of priesthood, and that this story may have been completely contrived at a later date to allow his legitimacy.
Yeah. For sure.
And the sanctity of life, which is supposed to be present in Judaism, was certainly violated by that story. And if I recall correctly, when you talk about Midianites, remember that Moses went to live with Ruel, who was the king of the Midianites, I believe, and his wife was a Midianite, and his children were Midianites.
Mm-hmm.
So this story is really kind of a disjointed, out of context story in a way, sort of like that story with Tamar. And I think that that has to be taken into consideration, that this story may be a justification story rather than anything that really pertains to the theology of Judaism or to the ethical principles of Judaism.
I would agree 100%. I think because I think it also presents, in many cases, sort of anomalies. If we look at it in the context of the larger, overarching ethos, ethics, and values of Judaism, even within the Torah.
Okay.
So I would
Okay.
agree.
The third point that just came up about things not getting any better. I think that in the bigger context, particularly for Judaism, things getting better. The Germans were supposed to be really very cultured, refined people, the head of their class in terms of many things, intellectual. And look what they did to the Jews in the Holocaust. And the idea that people are getting better, or that things are getting better, I think is a little bit too optimistic. I'm not so sure that everything is getting better. And I'm not so sure that we should be so confident that we're going to be headed into a better age. We may be far away from that. Little things are better, yes. But in the big picture, it can go backward in a hurry.
It can absolutely go backward, and by no means is everything better. I think but I also think that it's in the same way that it's I think false to say that everything is better, or disingenuous to say everything is better. I think it's also disingenuous to say everything is worse, or it's never been this bad. I think that there are areas of progress, but I agree it's not without many probably steps backwards, if not at the very least areas in which there's no progress. Brad.
Well, I'm going to go back to what Susan said, because I think she made an important point relating this passage to the Pinchas story. And the relationship to me is one of going from the macro to the micro, of going from a sense of communal guilt to individual guilt. Communal guilt in the same way as in the Oedipus story. The people are suffering a plague. As in Oedipus, Thebes is under a plague. And it's not until, because of the communal guilt, and it's not until the sin is extirpated that the plague is lifted. So we're dealing in that story very much with a communal guilt. And here we've moved to a micro sense of guilt, of individual guilt. And how do you deal with individual guilt?
Yeah, I think that dichotomy, I think, is spot on, right? Or maybe contrast is spot on, and I think there's an attempt to answer both, right? Merle.
I keep reading this as, who is exempt, who's not exempt, what is exemption, what isn't exemption. And I'm thinking about what everyone else has said, but something keeps coming up in my head, that we see awful things happen, murder, whatever, and we know that they aren't accidental. So how are people, and I don't see it in Judaism, but I see it other places, bless you, how are people so quick to forgive them?
Mm.
I mean, do you make up excuses of why you're forgiving them? I mean, that's what I'm finding in this is how do you determine what is exempt and what isn't exempt? And how do you determine what is intentional or not intentional? But then how do you, when you see something happen that you know this person had to come up in their head to do it, it had to have been premeditated. How do you justify it and forgive them so quickly?
Well, I would say two things. One, I think at least if we look at the texts here, are suggesting that exemption is a result of intention, right? So if it's accidental, then you're exempt and you can go to a city of refuge.
Right.
And maybe be forgiven. By the way, I would actually argue that if there's no intent and something happens, that the real forgiveness there is the person forgiving themselves for what they unintentionally did, and they have to live with the fact that they killed somebody unintentionally.
Right.
And I've encountered that with folks, and that's a heavier burden than what anybody else can place on them in most cases, right? Forgiveness, in general, much less when there is intent, is a whole other, Yom Kippur conversation, and whether or not somebody's made tshuva and whether they have remorse and what is forgivable and not. And I would agree with you that I don't think it can come quickly.
It just keeps coming up in my head that, you see these things and you hear these things, but it's difficult for me to conceive how you can say, give whatever excuse you want to give for what the person did. And I've known people, I know a woman from when we first got married, we lived in the same apartment building, that she hit a kid and killed him, in dark traffic, and the kid couldn't be seen. And he wasn't, it wasn't intentional, obviously, but till the day she died, she was living with guilt, which is what you just said. In some cases, people.
Look, I'll just to really put a pin on it, and it's probably on the website if you're interested. If it's not, send me an email and I'll send it to you. Rabbi Leader Steve gave us Yom Kippur sermon of, I want to say 4 years ago. Could have been 5 years ago. Everything feels sooner to me than it was. Gave a Yom Kippur sermon about two families in the congregation who each suffered a death that year as a result of a pedestrian being hit by a car. Both unintentional. Okay? However, one was a hit and run. The other was not a hit and run. And the individual who accidentally hit the pedestrian later, through a number of channels, reached out to express their remorse and apologize to the family of the pedestrian who was hit. And the point of Steve's sermon was to, in essence, contrasting what that difference meant in each of the families of the victims. Right? The difference between, taking responsibility, trying to make amends, and, waiting for the police to come find you. And so I think that it does, that's again, without making this all about the high holy days, which I just realized are 8 weeks away and I have lots of sermon work to do. That's the whole point of tshuva. That's the whole point of, taking responsibility and making amends and trying to repair relationships. But it doesn't come easy. Susan.
In addressing Merle's comment, I totally agree with you in terms of accepting responsibility for transgressions and certainly for murder. It has always bothered me that some people, parents who've had their child killed or something, that say, I forgive, and that's generally Christians. But let me get rid of my hand, my raised hand, who say, I forgive you. Well, it's not theirs to forgive. That's always bothered me. And there was a Holocaust survivor, a woman who went around saying she forgives Mengele or one of the other ones. That's not hers to forgive. She may, for others, she can for herself, and psychologically that's beneficial. But there's also an element, well, we're dealing with an element in Judaism of rachamim and of justice. Justice shall you pursue. And allowing murderers, I get it for unintentional, but allowing them off the hook, I think, is absolutely wrong. And there's, you know, the victims' rights groups now here saying, you know, what about a sense of justice for intentional murders? The second point, I think it's important, and Judaism does this, as you see here, by these endless conditions, to make distinctions and not to say all murder is wrong. There are distinctions, and we do that in law. And then also, you know, Brad fortunately put his finger right on it, the distinction between individual justice and justice for a community, right, a society. And to Jeff's point, when he said things haven't gotten better, well, Judaism's gift to the world was a sense, was a structure of morality and ethics and how one should behave, how society should, individuals in society should behave. Not that that a lot of people follow that, but that is, I think, essentially the beauty, one of the beauties of Judaism and the gift from the Bible, actually. This horrible early period of giving a set of conditions for an ethical behavior of individuals and society.
Isn't it interesting that the Bible starts out with death and murder of Cain and Abel?
No, it starts out with the creation of
creation, but yeah.
Which is,
you know, Susan, I think it's such
I hear you, Jeff. I mean, I agree with it.
And I think that's such a beautiful point, and I'm going to use it to sort of wrap us up, despite the fact that I have a dozen more texts. But to me, it's always a good sign when we get stuck on the second one, because the conversation gets so good. But you know, it's not uniquely Jewish necessarily, but it is, you know, in a way, Judaism's gift is this articulation of ethics and values and an attempt to shape human behavior. And you know, it's funny how things kind of align sometimes. I started my day today at 8:30 on Zoom with a young lady who's having her bat mitzvah in a few months, and she was going through a draft of her Devar Torah, of her speech with me, and she was talking about the Ten Commandments. And in essence, her statement or the statement she's going to make to everyone who's sitting there is still pretty relevant. Not there yet. Wouldn't the world be better? I told her my favorite paragraph she had in the whole speech was, and she doesn't call it out as being the Ten Commandments, but she basically goes through and says, you know, wouldn't we all be better off if we were all a little more honest? If we were less interested and jealous in what other people have than what we have? If we didn't lie to each other? If we didn't kill each other? If we didn't, you know, and she goes through, and I heard that paragraph and I thought, yeah, you know, and in a way to, you know, the point that, yeah, we haven't come that far, because here we are. It's not like, you know, retire the book, check, we're good on these values. It's no, we still need to be reminded of them, you know.
He needs to publish that.
Yeah, well,
Temple should publish it if
she's
she doesn't.
still working on it. It was a rough draft, but
Yeah, but
it was-
that's a place to start.
I know.
That-
It was
From
a
that
good-
age,
It
a
was
lot
a
of
great
people
way to
need to
start
hear.
writing. What was concerning to me is that her bat mitzvah is a week after Rosh Hashanah. She has a
Oh.
rough draft of her speech, and I have not even started on it. Much less Rosh Hashanah morning, much less Yom Kippur.
You may not have to if she carries us through.
I was going to say, I'll just rip it off.
Start with the 10th commandment and move forward. I think that's the only way to survive.
Well, that's the whole, yeah. I won't go there. It's a distraction. Thank you, everybody. Really lovely. And I'll miss you all next week because it's been lovely spending these past 3 weeks. I think I think this is the plan kind of for the summer, is that we're sort of each doing a chunk, so there's a little bit of continuity. So it's been great to spend a few weeks together, and look forward to seeing everybody soon. Shabbat shalom.
The girls off at camp next week.
It'll be good to cause trouble to somebody else for a change.
Never. Take care, everybody.
Jeff, everyone's
Shabbat
been warned.
Yeah, be prepared, be afraid, be very afraid.
I'm terrified.
Shabbat shalom.
See you soon.
Hello.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
You. Stay well, Jeff.
Thank you. Appreciate that
You
thought.
look great.
Don't get carried away.
I won't. I'll keep my mouth shut.
No, not at all.
Oh,
Not
okay.
at all.
As long
Bye-bye.
as I have your permission.
Of
I
course.
gotta go pick up a child at the airport. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, don't overwork yourself in the heat. It's only
Don't believe
110
me.
here today.
Our house is freezing,
Good.
and
Good.
so is my car. I
know.
don't